This is my workbench. It is okay. It is not the best, it is not the worst, but it's not the focus of this video. Instead, it's these drawers underneath, sort of. They were temporary drawers I stole from an old lathe stand that I made, must have been 5 or 6 years ago. They were only ever going to be a temporary solution, 5-6 months type thing. But now that has turned into half a decade. And I really need to make a better solution for storing all the things in here. I keep my marking and layout tools, so squares, pencils, marking knives, as well as my hand tools, chisels, hand saws, hand planes. It is, well, embarrassing to have everything thrown in there so haphazardly when I know I can do better than that. I don't have the time at the moment to completely revamp the whole thing, but what I've wanted for a while is a chisel tray. That's been on my to-do list for the last 3 years, so I'm slowly getting a little bit better. So in this video, I'm going to make a storage solution for my chisels that will, at least at this stage, go in these drawers. And eventually when I remake these drawers under my workbench, the chisels will already have a nice home to slot into it. The box doesn't need to be particularly tall, it's just holding chisels after all. So the sides of it are just 40 or hair over 40 mil tall, which is a little bit awkward for putting dovetails in, simply because it either means they're going to be just one single kind of large, relatively speaking, dovetail, or 2 or 3 really tiny fiddly ones. I opted to go for just one large dovetail because this is really a utility project that looks kind of nice rather than something that's deliberately meant to be beautiful as its primary reason to exist. While there is certainly skill involved with dovetailing, the tooling doesn't need to be overly complicated. A chisel and a dovetail saw do most of the work, though I am quite partial to cutting away the waste rather than chiseling it all out using a fret saw. This is the new Concepts fret saw, and it made me not hate fret saws and coping saws, so I highly recommend it. One of the things I didn't expect to be quite so satisfying for these dovetails was the tooling I was using, and not the fancy tools that I've bought, but the ones that I've made. In this case, I'm using the marking gauge that I made a few years back, the Moxon vise that I made a few years back with the Twirly Whirly kit, and for the first time I was using the brass hex-headed mallet that I made, which eventually I'll be selling. This is a prototype of a brass hex head that screws on to this way to the wooden handle. Squeaks a bit, but it's quite satisfying to use. This handle shape is prototype. I've since made a much nicer shape that I enjoy a little bit more. But it's just very satisfying making your own tools and then have them actually work really well. The extra weight from the brass head is just really fun to use. Next up, I needed to add a stopped groove. Now there's a few ways you can do this with hand tools or using the router table, doing a plunge cut that way, which I'm not a big fan of. So instead I used a jig that I invented a few years back called the small parts routing jig. I'm still not that good with naming things, but it gets the point across what it does. One of the biggest problems with routing small parts is actually safely holding it. So this jig using a wedge clamps down, and I can use a regular plunge router to make those stopped grooves. Of all the things that I've come up with, this is perhaps one of the simplest yet one of the most effective, and I'm always glad when I get a chance to use this jig. It's just so easy to use. To glue up everything can be flushed up pretty easily with either a chisel or a block plane, or in some cases both. You could do the same thing on the table saw or with a router table, but sometimes it's nice to go a little bit quieter and a little bit slower and make more deliberate choices with the tools that you're using. To create all the chisels in the box, I've got a couple of options. I could have plywood or hardwood to map the form of the chisel itself, little cutouts for the handle, so you use a Forstner bit, cut that in half, you get the semicircle. That would work just fine. I want to go a little bit fancier than that, so I want to go for foam. In terms of foam, there's probably two approaches you can go for. First is Kaizen foam. It's a relatively inexpensive polyethylene foam of a low density, and you can cut that just with a normal knife, and it's got stacked layers, so you cut out one layer and you peel it off, leave the rest behind. Quite like that stuff. I find it pretty fiddly, and while it's not hugely expensive, it can add up. What I want to go for instead is EVA foam, because I can cut that on the laser. Specifically going to be cutting these floor mats. They're jigsaw floor mats from Bunnings, textured on one side, smooth on the other. As you can see, it comes in a couple of different colours. I'm going to use black, but I could use blue if I wanted to. Now this is something I've actually done before, though I never actually published the video. You can do this with basically any diode laser or CO2 or whatever, and it cuts out super crisp. Really easy to work with. Even 5-watt models will work just fine. Great for tool trays like this. No, it's not the most space efficient way to do it, but it's really nice, so shut up. So while it looks fancy, it's quite easy to do. The only real tricky part is getting the shape of the handle on the chisel digitized, because you need the digital file to cut on a laser or a CNC or whatever. And there's a couple of quick tricks for that to make it a little bit easier. First off, grab a piece of paper, put it on the floor, grab your tool, put it on the paper, grab a small ruler, this is 150mm. Then you're going to grab your phone, open the camera app, stand like this and zoom in. You don't want to use any wide angle lenses, you want to use a long distance lens, which is telephoto lens, which is why I've got it on the floor, not on the workbench. Take your photo, then you can import that photo into a Canvas in Fusion 360 or whatever CAD program you use, and just trace it. Some of the dimensions you'll know, like the 1.5-inch chisel is 1.5 inches wide, so it's pretty easy to get the blade part right, but the transition to the handle is just annoying. I did do a couple of tests in cardboard to make sure everything fit pretty well, and I did need to tweak a couple of the profiles where it's transitioning from the shoulder to the blade to the handle, particularly on the smaller chisels where the blade is thinner than the handle, so it had to flare out rather than flare in. As you can see, the EVA is pretty flexible, which is what you'd expect from foam when you've got a hole in the middle of it. So to stiffen that up, I used one of the test runs in cardboard that I had made, and I've just double-sided taped it to the underside of the foam. I could use hot glue or maybe spray adhesive to do the same job, but the double-sided tape is going to work just fine. And it really stiffens the whole thing up. Again, not that it really needs it, but it's just a nice little detail. I could have ditched the foam entirely and just done the whole thing in cardboard, and that actually would have looked pretty nice, particularly with some chipboard on top of it, which also cuts and engraves really well on a diode laser. The foam cardboard hybrid is held into the box with hot glue, just regular hot glue. I probably could have used double-sided tape for it, but I didn't think of that. The inlay is not really going to go anywhere. It would just be more if I accidentally get a catch when I'm taking the chisel out of the box. Maybe it would lift the foam layer up. So I'm not entirely certain why I did this. Because the handles of the chisels are quite bulbous, they stick up a fair bit from the foam, so it's quite easy to grab them without having deliberate finger holes cut into the foam. If you really want the file to laser cut or CNC or whatever the pattern of the handles and don't want to draw it out yourself, the link to that is in the description below. It's free. I do not care if you use that or not. Thanks for watching.